This is a case about betrayal, murder, and a cover-up. On April 16, 1960, Irene Garza went to Sacred Heart Church in McAllen seeking to save her soul. Instead, she was suffocated. And you're going to find out that the man who did this is John Feit. There may be people who don't understand why an old man is being prosecuted. He looks like everyone's grandfather. But make no mistake, this is an evil man. He was a predator. He was a wolf in priest's clothing, looking to attack.
She was not only beautiful physically, she had a beautiful soul. I think she just loved her faith. I don't think she thought of it in terms of, oh, look how religious I am. It was like, this was my life.
Down here, it's a primarily Catholic community, and Easter is the high holiday. Irene, on Holy Saturday, with the church packed with everybody trying to cleanse their soul in this confessional, about 7 o'clock, walked in. She would never again be seen leaving that church. They'd later find her body in an irrigation canal, thrown like a piece of trash.
Irene was found 5 days after she disappeared.
And what had the killer done to her?
She was sexually assaulted, physically assaulted, and she died of suffocation. Back then, the church was very powerful. It was unheard of to be accusing a priest. You know, you just didn't do that.
My father, that was the deputy sheriff at that time, he approached his superior and asked him why is nothing being done. And he was told to just step away from the case. Just step away, let us take care of it.
Did the Catholic Church in those days have the power to prevent a suspect in a murder case from being arrested?
Yes.
The case died. It was a cold case. Is this the man that you knew as John Feit?
Yes.
He was perhaps the key witness in the case.
He assaulted her, bound her, and gagged her. As he left, he could hear her saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe."
We got a word for that in Texas.
What's that?
There isn't any forensic evidence that affirmatively linked John Feit to this crime in any way.
You will see her clothing.
Is there any evidence of DNA? The evidence will show you no.
You will see her purse.
Is there any evidence of fingerprints? The evidence will show you no.
You will see her shoes.
There wasn't enough evidence then. There won't be enough evidence now.
I don't expect that there'd be another case like this ever come around in my lifetime. The institution who was in the business of seeking salvation was complicit in covering up this murder. It was a case worth losing. It was worth taking a risk. It's a story that needed to be told.
"48 Hours, Sins of the Father" continues in 90 seconds.
Assistant District Attorney Mike Garza is not part of Irene Garza's family, but Irene Garza's story has been part of almost everyone's life in McAllen for generations.
Kind of grew to folklore, kind of grew of legend about a girl that, went to confession and, never left.
The story of the priest accused of killing a parishioner is finally being heard in a courtroom after nearly 60 years.
Does your Catholicism make it more difficult for you to go after this guy?
The church seeks to do good. It's the men in the church and the men at that time that did wrong. It became clear that on April 16th, 1960, John Feit murdered Irene Garza. He did this with malice aforethought.
At 85 years old, former priest John Feit hardly looks like the heartless killer the state says he was in 1960. It was a rainy Easter Sunday. Sylvia Acevedo Stern was then 18 when she received some news about her childhood friend Irene that she has difficulty talking about still.
We were all very scared. And it was just this scary unknown that someone you knew and that you loved had disappeared.
25-year-old Irene Garza had gone to confession at Sacred Heart Church the night before and had failed to return to her parents' home where she still lived.
That was not like Irene. She checked in all the time.
Parishioners had spotted Irene earlier that night, putting on a lace veil, kneeling in a pew, and in a confession line. But no one ever said they saw her leaving the church grounds.
People remembered her, whether she was your neighbor, whether your wife was jealous of her. People knew her.
Irene had been crowned prom and homecoming queen at the local college and Miss All South Texas Sweetheart. Noemi Ponce Siegler was part of Irene's extended family.
Do you remember how you felt about her? I mean, what she meant to you?
She stood out. She was elegant.
But Irene was far more than just a pretty face. She was a trailblazer, says her cousin, Linda de la Vigna.
She and her sister, Josie, were the first Mexican-American twirlers in history of McAllen High School. And then ultimately she became the drum majorette, the first Mexican-American drum majorette.
Irene had been the first in her family to go to college and graduate school. She became a second-grade teacher and chose to work with McAllen's poorest students.
Oftentimes she would use part of her salary to buy them school supplies, to buy them things that they needed.
And Irene was generous with her own family. Linda was just 9, but she still remembers their last conversation.
She had Easter baskets for us, and my brother and I were excited and jumping up and down because we just knew that she would not have forgotten us.
But before Easter Sunday, Irene had to go to confession at Sacred Heart Church. Religion played a central role in her life.
Every Sunday, she'd go to church?
Every Sunday. Every Saturday, she'd go to confession. It was a little bit of a family thing. Irene's going to confession whether she needs it or not.
When she disappeared, the search for Irene Garza was huge. 70 members of the Hidalgo County Sheriff's Posse, many on horseback, fanned out looking for Irene, and one of them was Noemi's father.
That man wouldn't even sleep trying to find Irene.
Sylvia remained at the Garza home for days after Irene vanished. She says at first everyone tried to hold on to hope. But then Irene's purse was found near a dirt road.
Is this the purse that you recall that was brought to the house?
Yes.
The news only got worse. Just up the road, they found Irene's shoe.
Is that Irene's shoe?
Yes, sir. And the shoe was a killer.
Then, 5 days after she vanished, everyone's worst fear was confirmed when Irene's body was found floating in an irrigation canal.
And I just remember her mother just dissolving. I mean, I just saw her just bending over in pain.
Irene was still partially dressed, but her blouse was unbuttoned and her underwear was missing. The autopsy showed she had been beaten and sexually assaulted.
It was showed that she was killed by asphyxiation, probably suffocation.
At first, there were few leads at the crime scene. Just an imprint of Irene's petticoat on the canal bank and a partial heel print from a man's shoe. But 2 weeks later, police discovered a curious clue. They drained the canal, and on the bottom, they found this, a photo slide viewer. The police turned to the public for help in identifying the owner. 2 days later, they received a note from Father John Feit, a visiting priest from the missionary oblates of Mary Immaculate.
John Feit writes a letter saying that slide viewer belongs to me.
Why in the world would he tell the police, yeah, that's my slide viewer?
I think it was taunting.
Taunting the police.
Taunting the police.
Police only grew more suspicious of the 27-year-old priest when he gave them different stories about that night. At first, he said, he had not heard her confession at all.
He changes it by saying later, why I took her confession in the rectory.
And there were other peculiarities. Feit had been staying temporarily at the rectory to help with the busy Easter holiday. But he kept going back to the pastoral house where he lived just a few miles away.
6 times in a 24-hour period. He used excuses like breaking his glasses, needing to get clean clothes, different things that became very suspicious.
And Father Joseph O'Brien, the assistant pastor, told police that Feit had some injuries the night Irene disappeared.
He noticed some scratches on his hands, some scratches that ran vertically down his hands and on the top of his arms.
Father Feit said he had been locked out of the pastoral house and had scratched his hands climbing up to the second-floor balcony.
They were on the back of his hands, and I guess this gentleman climbs the wall like this, but he said he got them climbing a wall.
They had a pretty good case against him. Why wasn't he arrested?
He was protected.
By?
By the hierarchy of the Catholic Church.
It's always been very difficult.
In the days after Irene Garza's murder, Sylvia Acevedo Stern was struggling not just with grief, but also with guilt. On the Saturday she vanished, Irene called Sylvia's house, hoping she could accompany her to confession. But Sylvia wasn't home.
That day might have been different. If I had been with her, she might not have gone to the rectory.
But why had Irene agreed to go to the rectory that night?
Your Honor, at this time, the state of Texas would call Anna Maria Hollingsworth.
A new witness, Anna Maria Hollingsworth, testified that Father Feit had pulled Irene out of the confessional before.
It's not the same, she says, going to confession anymore because I don't get to stay in the confessional.
He had pulled her out of the confessional, told her she was too good to confess in the confessional, and took her to the rectory.
Anna Maria says her friend Irene seemed confused by Feit's insistence. If that's true, why would she have gone with him to the rectory on that Saturday evening?
Because he was a priest, and you didn't fear priests back then. She had no reason to suspect he was going to do something violent or sexual to her.
What angers Mike Garza is that he says the church had warning signs about Feit. Just 3 weeks before Irene was killed, a woman named Maria America Guerra had been attacked in a nearby church.
A man that she had seen came up behind her, tried to stuff a rag in her mouth, threw her to the ground. And at that point, she was able to bite his finger so hard that she tasted blood in her mouth and get away.
Although the church suspected Feit, he was not turned in. Mike Garza says a source told him the solution was to send Feit a few miles away to Irene's family parish. What was the point of that?
I guess to keep an eye on him, I guess to protect him at the time. They certainly weren't going to turn him. To protect him.
So did he behave himself up until the time that you believe he killed Irene Garza?
No.
Is that what you looked like
Yes,
when you were about 20 years old?
Yes.
Garza found another new witness, Beatrice Garcia, who says in the weeks before Irene Garza was murdered, she had a bizarre encounter with Father Feit.
I was walking to work. A car approached me, and I said, "Can I help you, sir?" And he said, "I would love to take a picture of you dressed in black by the cemetery."
And that man in the car, who was it?
He was the priest. That's him right there.
He liked a certain look in a woman. You know, America Guerra, Beatriz Garcia, Irene Garza, they all looked the same. America Guerra was a violent attack, and maybe he got a little taste of it then and was looking for his next victim.
And Garza says that victim ended up being Irene. Yet, despite the evidence against Feit at the time, the case seemed to stall. Noemi Ponce Siegler recalls finding her father, one of the original investigators, very upset one day.
I saw him sitting in a chair with a white handkerchief, and he was crying.
Noemi says her father had been told his superiors would take over the investigation. Around that time, Irene's parents got a visit from Father O'Brien of Sacred Heart Church.
The church tried to placate them, saying, you know, even if it is him, we're going to take care of him. He would find justice within the church if it was him.
Irene's family had long suspected that there had been a conspiracy between the authorities and the church to protect Feit. They could never prove it then.
I'm showing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 108.
But the state says there is proof now.
I was stunned. I felt like I had a smoking gun at that point.
It's a letter written in 1960 from one church official to another. Garza says this is proof that the church and the Catholic sheriff at the time, E.E. Vickers, conspired to undermine the Irene Garza investigation.
At some point, the sheriff would meet with the DA and explain to them what a weak case they had against him in an effort to get it dropped.
In the letter, they were concerned about how the case might not only affect the church, but also the campaign of Catholic presidential candidate John F. Kennedy.
There are also political implications to this that could make this a juicy scandal for the opposition to Kennedy.
Father Thomas Doyle, a leading expert on clergy abuse, analyzed the letter for the jury.
And I believe I found in every paragraph some element that I found very unusual, but pointed to an attempt to cover this up, to make it go away.
But there was no getting away from Maria America Guerra's accusation because she had identified Feit. A year after Irene's death, he stood trial for attempting to rape Guerra, but the jury deadlocked. Rather than face a second trial, Feit pled no contest in 1962 to a lesser charge, aggravated assault.
And what happened to him?
He was fined $500.
$500.
$500.
The state calls Daryl Davis.
And Daryl Davis says he knows how that happened.
And who is that young man standing there?
That's Daryl Davis, Channel 5 News.
Davis is now a local attorney, but back in 1962, he was a young TV reporter who had covered the Maria America Guerra plea in this very courtroom.
Is that the clock that's on the back of that wall there?
Still there after 57 years.
Davis says around that time, he and several other reporters were summoned to an off-the-record meeting with Robert Lattimore, who was then the district attorney.
He said, we know, verbatim, we know that Father Feit killed Irene Garza. And I remember he said, and the church knows that he killed Irene Garza. So we have made some arrangements.
Davis says in exchange for that plea in the Maria America Guerra case, Feit would not be prosecuted in the Irene Garza case, and the church would send him away.
He said the church is going to put him in a monastery for disturbed or troubled priests, and he will be kept there for the rest of his life.
And so Father Feit disappeared from the area. the case was buried. Irene's parents died without knowing that decades later, it would be brought back to the surface by a former monk.
I covered up the evidence. I'm sorry for what I did.
To read more of the church letter, join us on Facebook at 48 Hours.
Your Honor, the state of Texas will call Dale Tashney.
Dale Tashney is 88 years old, a former monk from Oklahoma, and now the star witness at John Feit's murder trial. Tashney has waited years to be able to take the stand.
Do you remember what you were feeling at that moment?
Relief.
Relief.
This was my chance to tell what I knew, what I remembered.
In 2002, 42 years after the murder of Irene Garza, Tashney sent a letter to the San Antonio police saying he had information about the death of an unnamed woman in the 1960s on Easter weekend.
She went to confession to the priest. After hearing her confession, he assaulted her, bound her, and gagged her.
The priest's name was John Feit. The San Antonio police knew nothing about the case, but the Texas Rangers did. It just so happened the cold case had been reopened that year, and Ranger Rudy Jaramillo had been working on it without much luck. And then Dale Tashney came along.
That's a huge break for you.
Right.
Jaramillo got in touch with Tashney and was amazed by what he heard. Even though Tashney didn't know the name of the victim and had the incorrect date and city, Jaramillo was certain Tashney was talking about the murder of Irene Garza. Back in 1963, Tashney was a monk at the Assumption Abbey in Ava, Missouri. He says his superior ordered him to counsel a young priest named John Feit, who had just arrived at the monastery with an unusual story.
I was told that he had killed a woman and then asked if we could see if he would fit in the monastery and possibly become a monk. And I said,
murderer become a monk? Did that seem odd to you?
To me, yes.
Tashney says over the course of many months, Father Feit told him about that attack.
After confession, he took her blouse off. He fondled her breasts, and then after that, he took her down in the basement, and somehow she remained in the basement. I assumed that he tied her up down there.
Tashney says Feit told him he later moved her from the rectory to another location.
The next day, Easter Sunday, I believe it was, and he put her in the bathroom, put her in the tub, and he had put her in a bag or something over her head.
Some sort of a plastic bag?
I don't fully remember. But when he was leaving, he heard her saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." With that, he shut the door and left. When he came back, he opened the bathroom door and she was dead. And then with the body, he dumped the body along the road by a canal.
Despite hearing all this, Tashney says he did not call police then because he felt his only job was to counsel the priest. But it soon became clear that Feit was not a good fit at the Assumption Abbey, and he eventually was sent to another monastery in New Mexico.
Send him out the door?
Yes.
Knowing what you knew?
Yes. Buried as much of it as I could.
Tashney eventually left the priesthood, got married, and raised a family. But in the early 2000s, he says he had a crisis of conscience and could no longer carry the burden of John Feit's story.
Did you know Irene Garza?
No.
As the jury listened, Tashney shared his story and the pain he felt for denying answers to Irene's family.
Did you know her parents?
No, but I knew she had parents. We'll move on to something else.
But it took 15 years from the time Tashney first came forward to get him in front of a jury. And this man, Irene Garza, is a big part of the reason why.
But you don't believe Feit ever confessed to him?
I don't believe so.
Garza was the DA in 2002 when Tashney came forward. He refused to charge Feit. We spoke to him in 2013.
I mean, why would he make up this conversation?
I don't know.
But why? What makes you think he did?
The fact that he had no specifics.
But Tashney was not the only new witness at the time. Ranger Jaramillo had also tracked down Father O'Brien, who said Feit had also admitted guilt to him. Jaramillo recorded an interview with O'Brien in which he matched many of the details in Tashney's account.
Did he put her anywhere to hide her, to place her in anywhere where he might have? The bathtub. Did he tell you how he killed her?
Well, she died from the gagging asphyxiation.
Garza did not believe Father O'Brien either. He says O'Brien had been diagnosed with a form of dementia.
Is he misunderstanding and fabricating in his mind a story that he might have heard about, might have read about?
Jaramillo felt O'Brien was clear-minded, but Irene Garza would not bend. Linda de la Vigna remembers he confronted her as she and Noemi Ponce Siegler tried to push him to prosecute.
And I'll never forget, he put his finger in my face and said, you know, you'll never get an indictment. You'll get one when pigs fly.
Linda and Noemi refused to back down, and in 2004, Garza finally seemed to give in to the public pressure, and his office took the case to a grand jury. But jurors would only be given audio tapes and transcripts of what Father O'Brien and Dale Tashney told investigators. They were never called to testify in person.
The charge has been made that you could have called them and that you didn't do it in this case because you didn't want to prosecute this case. Irene Garza's family is saying that's what the police are saying.
There's some interested parties that are saying that.
The grand jury did not charge John Feit, and he continued to live as a free man. He had left the monastery and the priesthood by 1972. He married and became a father and a grandfather, and had worked for decades at a Catholic charity when we found him near his home in Scottsdale, Arizona in 2014.
Sure. Well, let me just ask you straight out. Did you kill Irene Garza?
No.
Do you know who did?
No.
Well, Dale Tashney says that you told him that you did kill
Dale
her.
is full of
I'm sorry?
Dale is full of
Feit could not have known it then, but his time was running out.
Get lost, brother.
Shortly after our conversation with him, there was a big development in McAllen. Irene Garza, who had been DA for 32 years, was defeated by Ricardo Rodriguez, who promised to look into the case. And in February 2016, Feit was arrested and brought back to Texas to stand trial. But after nearly 60 years, is it too late?
To hear more of Father O'Brien's interview with investigators, join us at 48hours.com.
After hearing her confession, he assaulted her, bound her.
Dale Tashney's testimony allowed the prosecution to piece together the last hours of Irene Garza's life.
He put the young lady downstairs in the basement of the rectory at that time.
And this is the rectory?
Yes.
Prosecutor Mike Garza says because of the rectory's thick walls, nobody would hear sounds of a struggle or any screams for help.
And left her there?
And left her there.
And Garza says Father Feit went back to church to hear confessions. After parishioners left that Holy Saturday, Garza says Feit moved Irene a few miles away to the pastoral house.
Tashney's story was that he had placed her in a bathtub and had left her there while he was going to go back and say vigil mass. And at that time she said, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe."
Garza says when Feit returned from church, Irene was dead.
At the point that he left, we believe she was still alive, but with every intent to kill her. That's a depraved heart. That's a pretty cold heart.
That night, Easter night, Dale Tashney believes Irene was moved one last time.
He put her in a car and put her aside of the road near a canal.
Tashney's testimony has some details, but Mike Garza knows it also has holes.
Do you recognize that, sir?
Yes, sir.
In his letter to police in 2002, Tashney said the murder happened in 1962 or 1963 in San Antonio, several years after and more than 200 miles from where Irene Garza's body was found.
Why did you think it was in San Antonio?
Father Feit was from San Antonio. He went to school there.
Did you know what year this had happened?
Since Father Feit came to the monastery in 1963, I thought it happened in 1963.
Did you later find that you were mistaken?
Yes, but I wasn't easily convinced.
Defense attorney Renee Flores believes Ranger Rudy Jaramillo fed facts to Tashney so he could close the case.
Could you have done that? Did you do that?
No, sir.
Jaramillo says he corrected Tashney only because the former monk was racked by guilt, wanted to find Irene's family, and clear his conscience.
I had to set him straight as to when it happened and where.
But the defense says Tashney isn't simply mistaken.
He assaulted her, bound her, and gagged her.
Renee Flores says Tashney is simply lying.
Okay, but you were never told by Father Feit that she had been bound and gagged.
That's correct.
Tashney admits he assumed that because Irene didn't escape from the rectory.
After some time, he placed her in a cellophane bag and put her into a bathtub.
You also talked about a cellophane bag. We know that didn't happen, correct?
No, we don't know that that didn't happen. We know that he didn't tell me it happened.
Well, if he didn't tell you all of these different things, Mr. Tashney, why would you come forward to law enforcement and tell them that he did?
There were reasonable assumptions.
The prosecutors don't think the problems Tashney has with details make him unreliable, and they say much of his testimony is corroborated by what Father O'Brien, who has since died, told the police.
Did he tell you how he killed her?
Well, she died from the gagging, asphyxiation.
But the defense says O'Brien, like Tashney, got help with his story.
I think Joseph O'Brien was fed, given, or confronted with what the investigators believed.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Renee Flores is arguing Feit was never prosecuted because of a lack of evidence, not a conspiracy. And he questions Darrell Davis's testimony about that off-the-record meeting with the prosecutor at the time.
We were talking to the defense attorney, and he doubts this meeting ever really took place.
Really? Well, I'll look him straight in the eye and tell him that I remember it, parts of it, as clear as a bell.
But nobody is clear, according to Flores, on exactly when Irene went missing. He says witnesses saw her on church grounds more than an hour after the prosecutors say she was abducted.
She had been seen at least an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes later.
And if the jurors conclude a priest murdered Irene, Flores wants them to consider a different priest. Father Richard Junius was also hearing confessions at Sacred Heart that day and knew Irene.
Is Father Junius a reasonable other suspect in your mind?
Sure.
Flores says Texas Rangers interviewed Father Junius decades after the crime, and he seemed nervous.
If I recall correctly, Texas Ranger Jaramillo indicated that Richard Junius was not very happy about being interviewed. That suggests something. And why law enforcement ignored it, I don't know.
But Father Junius was never considered a suspect in the case, and he died in 2007, so he can't defend himself. But John Feit can, if he decides to take the stand at his trial.
There are several things I'd like to speak to.
Mr. Feit, would you raise your right hand, sir? Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give in the case now before the court is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
So help me God.
Very well, sir.
For years, people have been trying to get answers from John Feit about Irene Garza's murder.
There are several things I'd like to speak to.
And it looked like Feit might be considering taking the stand at his trial.
I'm kind of between a rock and a hard place here.
During a break, his attorneys consulted with Feit, who finally announced his decision.
Well, it was a wrestling match between my vanity and common sense, and common sense prevailed.
Mr. Feit, do you wish to testify in your own behalf?
No.
You think he would have been a good witness?
I think he would have been a great witness, but I think that the prosecutor would have done his very best to attack and eat him up.
Please rise for the jury.
With that settled, closing arguments can begin.
May I proceed? Yes, sir. May it please the court.
Prosecutor Mike Garza reminded the jury of the women he says Father Feit preyed upon.
He was a wolf in priest's clothing, waiting to attack. Attacked once, tried to attack again, and finally he got his prey.
Ask yourselves this. What evidence was there that John Feit had any intent to kill? What evidence did you hear? You're here to find facts. And sometimes there just aren't enough to convince beyond a reasonable doubt.
Feit went through the trial alone, without his family. And on December 7th, 2017, after 6 days, the cold case against the former priest was in the hands of the jury.
The jury began their deliberations just this afternoon.
I was confident. I felt we had the right jury in the box.
And that carried you through the first, what, 2 hours of
deliberation? That carried me probably through the first 2 hours.
And then what happened?
It started taking long.
We received another note from the jury.
And I started losing faith.
After 6.5 hours, there was a verdict.
Would the defendant please stand? We, the jury, find the defendant, John Bernard Feit, guilty of the offense of murder with malice aforethought as charged in...
John Feit, once a cleric, is now a convict.
Guilty.
Tell me what you're feeling.
Justice was served. Irene finally got her day in court, and that's all we ever wanted.
This is what we've been waiting for. Brought a smile to an old Texas Ranger's face. Yes, sir.
After 57 years, we have found justice for Irene. And for today, pigs are flying.
Mr. Feit, any words?
No comment. When you heard that Father Feit had finally been convicted, what did that feel like to you, knowing the role you played?
The debt is paid, both to Irene and to Father Feit. Justice has been done for the both of them.
The verdict against John Feit was one thing, but the jury still had to decide on his sentence. Linda and Noemi worried that Feit might be set free.
The jury might decide, because he is older and he's frail, that they would be somewhat lenient.
The morning after the extraordinary verdict, something else extraordinary happened. It snowed here along the border with Mexico as the sentencing process began.
It's snowing outside. Good morning.
And one last time, the lawyers addressed the jury.
It was a time where this man wasn't walking in a walker, where this man wasn't sitting here weak. It was a time when this man was strong.
Prosecutor Mike Garza pulled out the photo of Irene he carried close to his heart throughout the entire trial.
She was a person that was loved. We ask that you assess punishment at 57 years. Every year that he was free, having a family, getting married, hiding behind the protection of the church.
Is it a just penalty to impose a sentence upon a man who is different 60 years later? It's up to you to decide. But do you really think he's going to live 57 years?
4 hours later,
Would the defendant please stand?
the jury announced its decision.
We, the jury, assess punishment and imprisonment for a term of life.
It was a perfect plan. It was a perfect fight. It had the perfect result. Everybody won.
Except John Feit.
Well, he was the villain. The villain's not supposed to win.
I said, okay, Irene, I know what your message is. We must get back to respecting, caring, and loving each other. That's what we have to do. That's the lesson she taught us. She was so good.
She was and will be my hero.
For Mike Garza, this case tested his trust in the church. But in the end, he kept his faith.
I have crossed the emotional line in this case. This case was very important to me from my heart. I truly believed that faith would win, and it did.
I could see how much blood I was losing. I didn't really care whether I had legs or not. I just was going to be alive. I was going to be able to see Sarah, Cecilia, and Vanessa again. That became my motivation. It was my two little girls.
CBS News, original reporting.